Secret Seahorse Part 2, Chapter 7, End of the Ocean. Get your fresh ribbon, eel, Echo called to the crowd of customers at Reef Fish's store. She tried to be cheerful. Her family shop was the last place she wanted to be, but her father had insisted she help out at the huge high tide sale. They'd been so busy that she hadn't had a chance to think about seahorses until Crystal put a lovely hatchet fish on the rock counter for a customer. After the happy shopper left, Crystal asked Echo, "Did you think about what I said about seahorses?" Echo had thought of nothing else, but for some reason she didn't want her sister to know. Echo shrugged. A little. Crystal wiped the rock counter while there were no customers and said, "Some creatures just should not be pets." Why not? Echo asked. All her life she'd dreamed of riding a seahorse. Why was that so bad? Crystal frowned. Because they should be able to choose, she said. Echo held up a ribbon eel. This eel didn't choose to be someone's dinner. That's different, Crystal snapped. How? Echo asked. Crystal spun on her pink tail and swam over to the other side of the store without answering her little sister. A big crowd of people wanted the pickled spotted oarfish, and Crystal helped serve them. Echo knew she should help too, but she didn't. She just floated behind the eel counter and thought about Zollie. Where's your plankton bow? Shelley asked Echo the next morning on their way to school. What? Echo asked, putting her hand where her bow usually went. Oh, I forgot it. Shelley looked at Echo strangely. Echo shrugged. She almost always wore glittering pink plankton to decorate her dark hair. In fact, she had tried many times to get Shelley to wear it too. But this morning, Echo had totally forgotten. I can't stop thinking about Rocky Seahorse, Echo told her friend as they floated past Mer Park. I was even going to go visit him yesterday after tail flippers practice, but my dad made me help out at the store. I hope you had time to study your spelling words, Shelley said. Oh no, Echo said, scooting to a stop. I forgot all about that stupid spelling test today. How could you forget? Shelley asked. Echo looked ready to cry. Every time I started to study, I thought about Zollie. Sweet seaweed, Shelley said. What am I going to do? Echo wailed. Let's study on our way, Shelley suggested, pulling Echo toward school. The first word is pipefish. Echo concentrated. P-I-P-F-I-S, she said. Shelley frowned. No. Sound out pipe and fish. Let's try another one. How about sea dragon? Echo took a deep breath and tried again. C D-R-A-G-U-N. Is that right? Close, Shelley said. What am I going to do? Echo squealed. I don't know any of them except for seahorse. Oh, how I wish I had studied. Well, it's not the end of the ocean, Shelley said. We'll study the rest of the way to school. I hope that's enough, Echo said. But she had a terrible feeling it wouldn't be enough at all. Chapter 8, Right or Wrong. Echo couldn't believe it when she saw her spelling test. At the top of the page was a big 0 in octopus ink. She hadn't gotten one single word right? Unfortunately, Pearl saw Echo's test too. Echo missed every word, Pearl shrieked. That's terrible. Pearl, please keep your eyes on your own work, Mrs. Carp said sharply. Echo put her arms over her test and looked at Rocky. He grinned and gave her a thumbs-up sign. Rocky wasn't known for being great at spelling either. Echo had been wrong. It wasn't a bad day. It was the worst day in the history of the ocean. She had never failed a test before. What would her parents say? There's Pearl making fun of Echo. Echo sighed and took a quick look at her spelling test. She had even left the E off the end of seahorse. Why did seahorse need an E at the end? Echo shook her head. She definitely couldn't understand spelling. It made no sense. But of course, she hadn't really studied as hard as she should have because she kept thinking of Zollie. Mrs. Carp, Echo said, I have a question that's sort of about our spelling words. She paused. Is it wrong to keep seahorses captive? My sister says it is. Hey, what's the big idea? Rocky snapped. I thought you liked Zollie. See if I ever let you ride him now. I'm not asking to be mean, Echo explained. I just want to know. She did want to know what Mrs. Carp thought, but now she felt really miserable. Rocky would never let her ride Zollie again. Mrs. Carp tapped her chin with her white tail. That is an excellent and important question, she said. Let's see how the class feels. Raise your hand if you think it is okay to keep seahorses as pets. About half the Mer class raised their hands, including Rocky, Adam, and Pearl. Rocky stuck his tongue out at Echo. Now, who thinks it is wrong to keep seahorses on a leash? Mrs. Carp asked. The rest of the Mer class lifted their hands, including Shelley and Kiki. Echo slowly held up her hand, although she wasn't exactly sure what she believed. She told Mrs. Carp, I don't know what to think. I just want the answer. Is it wrong or not? Mrs. Carp looked at the third graders. I can't tell you what to think, Echo, or you, Rocky, but the more all of you know, the better decisions you can make. That may have been a good answer, but it was not the one Echo wanted. Chapter 9, Wild Creatures. Why couldn't Mrs. Carp just answer the question? Why didn't she just say keeping seahorses is okay or not? Echo asked Shelley. It was the next morning as the Mergirls swam to school. Echo had been mad at Mrs. Carp since yesterday. Echo had also been upset with herself for lots of reasons. She felt horrible that she'd made Rocky feel bad about having a pet seahorse. She'd also made him so angry that he would never let her ride Zollie again. And she'd managed to miss every single word on her spelling test. She wished she could start this whole week over again. This time she would definitely study. Shelley floated past a Mer statue in Mer Park. Well, maybe it's one of those questions that's hard to answer, she said. Well, teachers are supposed to know everything, Echo snapped. Then she felt horrible for being mean to Shelley. Shelley didn't seem to mind. She put her hand on Echo's shoulder and said, Mrs. Carp said our guest speaker will help us. At the end of school yesterday, Mrs. Carp had told the Mer class she would invite a special guest to discuss seahorses with them. Hopefully, the guest could come on short notice. Echo wanted some answers, and she wanted them now. What she didn't want was the surprise she got. Mom, Echo said when she saw her mother in her third-grade classroom. What was she doing here? Suddenly, Echo was worried. Did Mrs. Carp call her mother in to speak to her about the zero on her spelling test? Echo knew she was in big trouble now. Good morning, Echo, Mrs. Carp said. I've asked your mother to help us continue our discussion on seahorses. Echo was relieved she wasn't in trouble. As the rest of the Mer class swam into the room and sat at their desks, Echo read the poster at the front of their classroom. Seahorses, pets or free. Class, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Eleanor Reef. She runs the Conservatory for the Preservation of Seahorses and Swordfish. Some of you may have visited it. Dr. Reef is also Echo's mother. Mrs. Carp paused to nod at Echo. Out of the corner of her eye, Echo saw Pearl and Rocky frown at her. Echo stared straight ahead and wondered what her mother was going to say. I'm delighted to visit your classroom. I thank Mrs. Carp for inviting me. She mentioned that you've had some questions about seahorses, Dr. Reef said. The Conservatory for the Preservation of Seahorses and Swordfish does not believe in keeping wild creatures as pets. Finally, someone had answered Echo's question. Why didn't she think to ask her mom at dinner last night? But, her mother continued, the problem is the definition of what exactly is a wild creature. Rocky is a wild creature, Pearl said with a giggle, but she quieted down with a glance from Mrs. Carp. Wild creatures can be a danger to mer people. They often carry diseases as well, Echo's mother said. Some people would argue that seahorses are not wild, but domesticated. What's that? Rocky blurted. That's when animals have been kept as pets for thousands of years, Mrs. Carp explained. Kiki raised her hand. Dr. Reef, are seahorses endangered? Echo's mom nodded. Yes, and some people feel that keeping them as pets may protect them from extinction. That is a good point. That's right, Rocky's friend Adam said in agreement. But, Echo's mom continued, we must also consider if the animal depends on mer people for food. Can it live on its own, or does it need us to survive? Echo looked at Rocky. She knew he was thinking the same thing she was. Did Zollie need him, or could Zollie live on his own and be happy or free? Chapter 10, Second Chance. Echo wanted to ask her dad what he thought about seahorses, but he worked late. She already knew how her mom and Crystal felt. She went to her bedroom early and drew seaweed pictures of seahorses, large and small. She drew some with 4 legs. By the time she went to bed, her hands were covered with octopus ink. She was tired, but she couldn't sleep. Her sea-fan bed felt lumpy as she twisted back and forth. She couldn't get Zollie out of her mind. Did he hate being Rocky's pet or not? The next morning she forgot her glowing plankton hair bow again. She even forgot her breakfast of parrotfish pancakes. She knew she had to see Zollie before school began. She needed to be careful because if Rocky saw her, he'd really get mad. After all, she was the one who'd started asking questions about whether keeping a seahorse was right. Without making a bubble, Echo floated around Rocky's big shell and the smaller shell behind it. She couldn't believe what she saw. Rocky gently hugged Zollie before unleashing him. Zollie nudged Rocky one last time before galloping away. Echo wanted to scream stop, but she didn't. Maybe it was better if Zollie was free, but if it was for the best, why did Echo feel so sad? Rocky turned toward her with tears in his eyes. When he saw Echo, he screamed, What are you doing here? I should have kept Zollie a secret. This is all your fault. Echo rushed off. She didn't stop until she sat in her chair at school. She put her head down to keep her friends from seeing the tears on her cheeks. What had she done? At lunch, Shelley and Kiki tried to get her to eat. Look, Mr. Fangtooth made white sea whip pudding, Kiki told Echo. He must be in a great mood. Ever since they had returned his letter the other day, he seemed happy. That was unusual. Mr. Fangtooth was normally very grumpy. I'm not hungry, Echo told her friends. Rocky will never forgive me. I made him give up his best friend. Shelley tried to cheer her up. Don't be upset. Rocky won't be mad forever. Echo's eyes brimmed with tears. But what about Zollie? Do you think he'll be okay? Shelley looked at Kiki and the two friends smiled at Echo. Sure. Rocky said Zollie was caught as an adult, so he lived on his own before, Kiki said. I'm sure he's fine. Echo felt a little bit better, but she still could only drink a bit of seaweed juice. She almost spit up the juice when she had a terrible thought. Didn't Rocky say Zollie was old? Maybe he was too old to be in the wild. Would you like to come to my dorm room after school? Kiki asked. Shelley and Echo lived in Trident City, but Kiki's family was so far away, she lived in the Trident Academy dormitory. Echo shook her head. Not today. Don't worry, Shelley told her. You'll feel better tomorrow. I sure hope so, Echo told her friends. She felt terrible, and she realized Rocky probably felt worse. If she had a pet, she'd be mad if someone suggested she set him free. And she worried about Zollie. She hoped he was safe. Echo still didn't know if it was right to keep a pet seahorse. She still didn't know how to spell pipefish, but she knew there was something she had to do after school. She had to apologize to Rocky. After swimming home, Echo watched Shelley float off toward her apartment at the People Museum. As soon as Shelley was out of sight, Echo took off for Rocky's shell. What would he say to her? Would he yell? It made Echo want to turn around and hide, but she didn't. The closer she got to Rocky's, the more worried she became. This was not a good idea, she whispered to herself. I should go home. Still, she bravely knocked on the side of Rocky's shell. Nothing happened. No one came to the front sea curtain. Just as Echo was about to give up, she heard a noise coming from behind the big shell. She swam to the back and was amazed. I can't believe it, Echo cheered. Zollie had returned. Not only that, but he'd brought a friend. Zollie was in his pen nuzzling a female seahorse. Rocky swam up beside Echo. Did you see? He said with a huge grin. Echo giggled. Zollie came back. He had chosen to be Rocky's pet. With a friend. What do you think we should name her? You want to ride? Rocky blurted. Yes, Echo squealed. How about Pinky? She's such a pretty pink and yellow. Echo sat on Pinky's back and Rocky got on Zollie. Together they rode around Trident City. Echo waved when they trotted by Pearl. Pearl floated with her hands on her hips and a huge frown on her face, but Echo didn't care. She was so happy. She had gotten a second chance to know a seahorse. It was almost like having one of her very own. Hey, Rocky, Echo said, do you think Mrs. Carp will give us another try on our spelling test? Rocky looked at her and shrugged. Maybe. Echo made up her mind to ask her teacher tomorrow. Even if Mrs. Carp wouldn't let them take the test again, Echo vowed to study very hard for the next one. Echo knew sometimes mermaids don't get a second chance, but luckily for her, sometimes they do. The end. The Mermaid Tales song. Let the water roar, deep down we're swimming along, twirling, swirling, singing the mermaid song. Shelley flips her tail, racing, diving, chasing a whale, twirling, swirling, singing the mermaid song. Pearl likes to shine. Oh, my Neptune, she looks so fine, twirling, swirling, singing the mermaid song. Shining Echo flips her tail, backward and forward without fail, twirling, swirling, singing the mermaid song. Amazing Kiki, far from home, floating so free, twirling, swirling, singing the mermaid song.